So Brandon was named one of Pittsburgh's 40 under 40 in 2012 and a rising education leader in 2017. Brandon has nearly 20 years of experience in the nonprofit, service learning, and international education sectors. In his work as executive director of Amizaji, Brandon has organized over 700 global service learning programs, overseeing life-changing global experiences for nearly 10,000 students, and spearheading sector-changing innovations like the global switchboard and the concept of Fairtrade Learning. In addition to his work with Amizaje, Brandon was a US delegate to the One Young World Summit in Zurich in 2011. He's published several articles on responsible global service learning in peer-reviewed journals. He sat on a planning committee for the Pittsburgh Holocaust Center and was the president of the Pennsylvania Council on International Education. So I'm handing it over to you. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me here today. Thank you for organizing this forum. It's very unusual that there's an entire series around. I'm grateful to get to contribute to it in any way possible. I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm very bad at this, so bear with me for one moment while I do that. All right.
You got it.
You did it. So the first time I realized I was doing harm in global volunteerism, global volunteering, I was fresh out of college. I had co-founded a small nonprofit organization that was working in refugee camps with very vulnerable spaces in Botswana and Zambia. And I had the opportunity to meet with and make friends with a lot of different people from a lot of different parts of Africa. And one of my friends asked me to take some photos with them, and I had a digital camera. I was like the only guy around with a digital camera, and I did that. I took pictures of his family for him, and he asked me if when I returned to the States, if I could print those pictures and send them to him. I did not do that. I don't know why I didn't do it. I was busy. I neglected it. I forgot. I just didn't do it. A few years later, Facebook came to fruition and was invented, and immediately my friend friended me on Facebook and sent me a message asking me where those photos were and why I hadn't sent them. He had been repatriated actually, and was kind of just following up and gently calling me out on it. And I realized very quickly what a personal mistake that was, and how I had actually probably caused some harm. I had committed to something and I didn't follow through, and I broke trust. And I always look back on that and feel very, very, very concerned for my life's work. In that the smallest of commitments, the smallest of relationships can so easily be impacted by these type of experiences. And the good news is that that is a very small bit of harm, and I'm sure I've done much worse harm over the last 15 years. Here we see in the news sometimes that there's very serious harm. We're not talking about small commitments being broken, but of course, last year a news story broke in Uganda of a young American woman who had created a charity that was doing some medical volunteering work with a very underserved population, and a lot of these children ended up dead. That, of course, would be the extreme example of what harm in global volunteering can be. Of course, the vast majority of these type of experiences do less harm. I wouldn't be doing this work, and I think most of us on this call would not have eagerly signed up to have these experiences if we didn't believe in connecting with dissimilar folks and contributing and collaborating in positive ways. And this is a small news article just recently that came about and how the international volunteering sector and local volunteering sector has adjusted its ways in order to respond to COVID-19 virtually. So again, the vast majority of what we do is not super harmful. In fact, it's hopefully helping. But almost all of what we do is done with good intentions. And that does not mean that good intentions can't hurt or even worse other people. And so my life's work is to make sure that any commitments I make in this type of work are fulfilled and the expectations are met, and that folks are getting more joy and justice out of relationships that they otherwise wouldn't have had. And I should also mention again that little example of the harm and the pain that my friend felt for me not following through is very small compared to much of what we've seen over the years and much of what is possible in this type of work. So
Brandon, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you turn on your camera? We'd love to see you.
Oh, I didn't realize you can't see me.
It's okay.
I couldn't see myself. Thank you for saying that. Why is my camera not?
It's okay if it's not.
It doesn't seem to even give me the option. Oh, here.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Can you still see me?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So the goals for this webinar are, one, to provide a framework for doing less harm in these type of experiences, whether that be in service learning, volunteer programs, internships, and other short-term trips. I also really hope that you can gain some practical tools and approaches and a few resources for vetting how to do this and engaging in these type of experiences. I think we got a great anecdote in terms of what one of the folks on this call were experiencing in Ethiopia in terms of orphanage tourism, it sounds like. And what we want to try to do is avoid those types of relationships and provide opportunities and experiences that are mutually empowering for all folks involved. So, but before we jump into things, I kind of want to define some terms because you've heard me say the words global service learning already, global volunteer. They're slightly different. And I just want to be clear that really when I say global service learning, I'm talking about something that might be a little bit more intentionally designed, that has a curricular backbone to it. It's typically going to have a reflective component. I strongly recommend that if you are engaging in any type of volunteerism, whether it have a curriculum or not to it, that you try to have a reflective backbone as a part of it. We find that outcomes for both community members and for participants volunteering can be greater when this is included in it. A global volunteer doesn't necessarily have to have that backbone. And I also want to mention that I use the word global intentionally and not international, because we find that we can do global work very locally, right? So our organization works in the Navajo Nation here in the United States. We work in Puerto Rico. We work in here in Pittsburgh in communities that are quite diverse, that for many of our participants, it's quite a global experience. A little bit about the organization that I come from. I think this will help better understand who I am and what kind of makes us tick. So amizade is the Portuguese word for friendship. We were founded in Brazil in the Amazon 26 years ago, initially as basically a volunteer vacations organization, taking some wealthy people from Chicago down to the Amazon and trying to make their vacations matter a little bit more. And we realized through this process that actually with a little bit more intentionality, with a little bit more of a framework, we could have some serious and empowering outcomes for both the visitors and for the host community. I'm sure that we're the only organization in the city of Pittsburgh that was founded in the Amazon, and it's quite a weird story how we ended up being based in Pittsburgh after 26 years. We're pretty small. We have a staff of just 10 here in the United States and around 35 around the world. Of course, the pandemic has disrupted this quite a bit, and one can imagine that it's, for an organization and an entire sector based around movement and travel, it's very difficult to do this work. We have transferred a lot of what we do virtually, but no doubt that staff number is starting to decrease a little bit. We've worked with over 26,000 participants in over 20 communities. Each year we collaborate with around 100 different education partners, mostly universities and high schools, although we also work with government agencies, community groups. We do some really interesting corporate social responsibility work and some neighborhood stuff as well. We have really 3 goals to improve the world. The first thing we do is try to link diverse networks. That is that we want to bring people together who would otherwise never be in the same room. It's why I love forums like this, because they kind of bring a whole array of ideas globally into one space. For us, it's not just good enough, though, to break bread. We also want to see some behavior changes in that room. That is, that specifically when increase empathy and civic engagement. You see that we don't really even use the word service, because service has the sort of conventional connotation that you have to have, hammer and nails, and you're building something, you're creating something, you're working with someone who's more vulnerable than you or something like that. We actually don't subscribe to that approach. And finally, we want to kickstart and catalyze some sort of social action. I think it's really important also to mention that our approach is such that social action, that volunteering, that civic engagement, whatever you call it, does not necessarily have to happen in a host community. By that, I mean our friends, for example, in the Navajo Nation, many of them feel like they've been colonized and conquered for hundreds of years, and like the last thing they want is outsiders coming in and quote unquote helping them. What oftentimes our friends are telling us is they want, it's almost like the best volunteer work that a young person can do in their community is just to listen, to sit back and listen for a week or 2 weeks. And then when they return home, to break down some of the stereotypes of what it is to be a Native American in the year 2020. So there are all sorts of reasons why folks choose to volunteer. I think if we had the ability right now to popcorn out ideas, folks in this webinar would have all sorts of different reasons. Oftentimes it's to do good, to help out, to contribute, to share resources and knowledge. We know that there's data that volunteering increases your life expectancy, happier. There's all sorts of interesting studies around volunteering. We ask every single one of our volunteers, what did you get out of this? Why did you end up doing this? And why would you do something like this again? And what we find is the following statistics here, that it gives people get a new appreciation, for the challenges of our times. It increases your feelings of empathy. It helps you engage in making the world a more equitable place, which we find is very important to people. It makes people feel as if they're part of something bigger, that they could be, almost more of a global citizen than anything. They make friends. It's a bonding experience, right? It's very healthy in a lot of ways. And then, of course, it brings about this inspiring way to do further good in the world for folks. So the model that we recommend as an organization, and I want to share this as like a very explicit tip, is that whether you're inviting folks into your community for 2 weeks to do something very concrete or very specific, or whether you are thinking of yourself as a volunteer in another community, the probably most important tip we can give is to see the experience not just as an immersive one. That is, that your time in helping, quote unquote, or your time in volunteering is not just confined to your time in that community, or if you're hosting in, having visitors at that time. But really it should start weeks or months prior. And so and it should continue if it's been effective for the rest of your life. Whether it's a positive experience or not, we should try to intentionally take a baton and kind of run with it once we return home to our home communities. And really, if we're intentional about this, in the pre-immersion side of things, we should be sensitizing folks and setting expectations. We should try to manage savior complex or white savior complex prior to the experience, right? And by that, I always try to tell visiting volunteers right off the bat, like, look, you might feel or be excited about, and especially college students, they always think they're gonna end poverty in a week in like Trinidad. And it's nothing against them. They've been almost bred in some ways in some of our cultures to believe that they can do that. And so our job as an organization oftentimes is to break that down immediately. And sometimes I'm very explicit and I tell them, like, you are not going to end poverty in Trinidad. Like, you need to understand that right now. And there should be orientations. We should be learning about community and culture and travel. There's so many important things. We opportunity to work with some pretty high-powered consultants in some of our corporate social responsibility work. And I think probably the most important thing we do is to break down this almost pre-belief that these folks have the ability to solve any problem in a short period of time. And we do that by introducing them to all sorts of cultural nuance and understanding that you cannot just kind of parachute into a community and change it overnight. In fact, that is insulting to many of our friends to have that attitude. We oftentimes recommend that people are volunteering in their own communities before they kind of get out into the world. It's very important that communities are sensitized, right? So especially if this is a first-time engagement type experience, and you're suddenly bringing a bunch of outsiders into a neighborhood, folks really need to understand what's about to happen, how that might impact the social fabric, why it's happening, should it happen, all of these types of questions. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of health, safety, and security and logistical preparation that needs to be done as well. During the immersion, there's a few tips that we always want to recommend. If there's not reflection going on, if there's not space for both community and visitor conversations, it's a pretty bad recipe, actually. And that can play out in all sorts of different ways. But at the end of the day, there should be some sort of daily or every sort of frequent forum to break down how things are going, what's working, what's not, how people are doing. We're hoping that people are stepping out of their comfort zones in these experiences. If we're not, there's usually some sort of problem. If there's like a bubble of foreigners kind of roving around in a community, we want to obviously avoid that. And then this is oftentimes also where people are most excited, but to be quite frank, it's not necessarily where all the great work happens. We find that while volunteers are really eager to get out there and kind of get dirty, it's a short period of their life, and it's also a short period of a community's welcoming period as well. It's what they do when they return home, and it's how the community acts after those volunteers leave that really matters. It's what you do in your hometown, how you act as a citizen, how you act as a neighbor, that can really start to move justice forward. And so we always recommend thinking about the monitoring evaluation right off the bat in these programs, and not only monitoring and evaluating the physical project that volunteers are working on, but what comes next after that in their own lives. We believe that there should be reflection afterwards, that there should be outlets for advocacy and engagement. I mean, the first time I had an experience like this, I came back to the United States and just kind of like laid in bed for a week. Many people we find get back into the grind of the rat race, or they are college students and they're back at the parties, and it's not necessarily their intention when they leave the community, but it's what happens in life. So figuring out ways or hooks to keep people engaged is really important. So education spending in the United States is a really big deal for us, and here's why. Basically, in my country, if you're rich, you spend money. If you're even upper middle class, you spend a lot of money on your children outside of the classroom. And in fact, we find that the gap in spending in education is much greater outside of the classroom than it is inside of the classroom. And unfortunately, a few years ago, we realized that we were part of the problem, that a large share of the inequity was with us. And if you look at this gap here that was created through from the 70s to the 2000s, This is not happening because of karate lessons and because of piano lessons and things like that. This is happening from international trips and oftentimes international volunteer trips, which cost quite a bit of money. So not only do we have all sorts of harm that can be done in communities, we also have, we're a part of a large inequitable structure. A few years ago, and now 10 years ago, one of my heroes and a good friend of mine, Mr. Brown in Jamaica, our site director, said to me, "Hey, Brandon, I know that your students are going back to the United States, and I know that they're putting on their resumes that they served in Jamaica for a few weeks, and they're getting better jobs as a result of that. But what are we supposed to put on our resumes? That we like hung out with white people for a few weeks? Like, how is that going to, like professionally develop us? How does that really not just continue to contribute to some of the global North, global South inequities that exist? What are you going to do about it?" He really put me on notice. And I came back to the conversation with a lot of people around the world about, what are we going to do? And what we did was we created something called Fairtrade Learning, which hopefully everyone here on this call has had a chance to read a little bit about. And there are 2.8 billion reasons why we did this. Normally, if it wasn't a virtual space, I would try to like popcorn out and ask what you think those 2.8 billion reasons are. The reasons are money. That's how much money is in international cross-border global volunteering each year, $2.8 billion. So in 2010, we started to see all these major issues emerging in our sector. The first was that there had been a complete commodification of volunteering. And I want everyone to understand that money matters in these conversations. And we're going to see it when we talk about the case study for today. At the center of the case study is money. And a lot of for-profit companies have entered the fray in this work, and they're tourism companies. Their job is not necessarily in their mission to do anything other than make money. And that was a real red flag for us. And Mr. Brown has some interesting stories about having witnessed that in his own life. And we have seen it even get worse over the years with some of the humanitarian disaster chasing that happened after Hurricane Katrina. We see it in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in COVID-19. Are we going to start to see an influx of volunteers from New Zealand coming to the United States? I sure hope so, but who knows? We also saw that our community partners like Mr. Brown were requesting specifically more reciprocity. A lot of folks we work with around the world think of this type of work sometimes as being extractive in nature, that we're pooling knowledge from communities in the end, that it's not a mutually empowering experience, that in fact is very transactional in nature. And don't get wrong, and that our partners, and they tell us frequently, what they value most is, that there's this connection to the world, that there's tangible projects, that there is money generated for these experiences. But at each one of those sort of exciting prospects, it still never seems like a horizontal relationship, and it's because of money. And finally, there was no sector oversight. Nobody was policing us. There was particular concern around this orphanage tourism that we were seeing around the world, and specifically unskilled medical volunteering, which of course this Uganda case from last year highlights, where literally life and death matters were kind of at the hands of unskilled, untrained volunteers. And what we see is there's a wide spectrum of what this looks like out there. On the one side, there are these types of short-term volunteer projects that focus on profit. They chase poverty, they chase disasters, they're poverty tourism. They're not community driven. The communities are not designing or coming up with these projects. They're being developed by marketers sometimes, in Boston, and not necessarily the folks who have to live with the outcomes of these projects. Sustainability is not a part of it. Solidarity is not a part of it. Ethics is not really on the front of the conversation. And there's no evaluation. What we want to see is moving on the other side of the spectrum, where there are longer term partnerships. It is community driven. It focuses on solidarity. And right now, in the midst of COVID-19, solidarity is about what we can offer. And I have to tell you that it's really important. I look to our friends in Bolivia right now who are going through another round of unrest. And when we ask, how can we be better? A lot of it has to do with let's be present together. Let's have these virtual conversations. Let's talk about not just what's going on in Bolivia, what's going on in the United States as well. And we also hope that there's going to be a robust monitoring and evaluation. So we created this concept of Fairtrade Learning. We consulted with people all over the world, and we created this set of ideals, right? So every program and project is going to look a little bit different, but at the end of the day, we really hope that what we're doing is policing ourselves a little bit and offering a rubric or a toolkit for other organizations or other communities who are hosting volunteers to try to lay some groundwork so there can be more reciprocity always, more transparency. Where is this money going? I can't emphasize this enough. The reason why we use the words fair trade is because it was something that people in the West understood. It's a concept that acknowledges that there is any way we slice it, and that there is power dynamics, that there's a consumer almost in a volunteer experience. And as much as we wish that wasn't the case, there's a reality to it. And then last and most important, that these projects and these volunteer experiences are focused on equity and justice, all right? So we created this big rubric and you can find this online. And I strongly recommend that people kind of use this when you set up a volunteer program, or if you're going to volunteer, that you take a look and you kind of grade the experience you're about to have on these projects. And so a good example of this is just one of the elements in the Fairtrade Learning rubric, is that of how are we recruiting, how are we finding volunteers, what are we publishing on, and what does that look like? We really want to avoid stereotypical images. When I look back to Amazaji 8, 10, 15 years ago, oh my gosh, we were totally a part of this problem, right? We were perpetuating white savior complex in the images we were using. And I think everybody knows, and my understanding is you've already talked a little bit about this, but we were really very much at an entry level, and we should be going to a more ideal level on this, where the education or the recruitment materials are serving an educative formula. I'm going to give two quick examples of how Fairtrade Learning has helped us. The first is in Brazil. We've worked there for like 20 years, and we didn't really have a framework for how we were ethically engaging with the community. The community was driving the projects and the programs, but we weren't sure if there was equity or justice really happening. And one thing we found was, and it is the only place on earth that we do any sort of medical work. We've worked in a clinic for many years. We work with States and medical. And we were finding that our medical students had these incredible opportunities to go on this medical volunteership through tributaries of the Amazon, and they were having these life-changing moments. But community members, when we sat down with the Fairtrade Learning rubric, were saying, you know what? There's room here for us to do better, because medical students, nursing students, pharmacy students here in Brazil do not have that opportunity to go on these ships. They can't, even though it's their backyard, they can't just kind of get up and get on this boat. It costs a lot of money. So what we ended up doing was working with medical institutions, medical schools here in the United States, to guarantee that every one medical student that was being sent down was also subsidizing the cost for a local medical student to have the same access. It seems small, but that one intervention was quite revolutionary 6-7 years ago for our partnership. And then finally, a quick story on how no matter what we do, it's still a process. We still can do harm in this work. I mean, my life is preaching now, trying to do less harm in global volunteering. We train all of our participants, all of our community members. We are literally the founders of this concept of Fairtrade Learning. And yet a few years ago, our marketing coordinator approached me and said, hey, Brandon, I got a serious problem for you. And he shows me on his phone an Instagram post of one of our participants in Ghana giving a vaccine to a baby. And I was like, and she's got all these positive hashtags. She tagged us in it. We went into damage control mode. How could this happen? What is going on here? We don't even work in anything related to medicine in Ghana. And it's the opposite of what we try to train everyone to do. So we did a little bit of an internal study on this, and it turns out that our community partners said that this person was sort of walking down the street, ran into some nurses, made some friends. They invited her in for whatever reason. She did this. She was a young person, and one of the big lessons for us was that even when we set out to do no harm or to do as little harm as we can, and it still happens. We still, by nature of this type of work, can make mistakes. We still can, it's up to people, it's up to humans. And good intentions are just simply not enough in this work. All right, so I always try to share that story because, we actually don't know. We believe that everything turned out just fine and it was kind of routine, but it was super embarrassing. As we look to other resources to guide us in this work, there is no better resource than To Hell with Good Intentions. If you haven't read this speech, I strongly recommend that everyone go and Google it right now. You can find it online. And all of our participants read it, and yet some of our participants, when you have 26,000, end up still doing things like that. I also recommend checking out the global community-based global learning collaborative, wonderful organization founded by my predecessor at Amazaji. COMLA, there's actually an entire organization in Ireland entirely dedicated to doing less harm in international volunteer work. They have a great toolkit that you can go on and find out both as a participant or as a community. Liberating Structures, if anyone's interested in how to do reflection really well. We find it's not set up for global service learning, but that's what we use it for. A friend of mine wrote a book, Judy Lasker, called Hoping to Help, which is like an incredible resource for this. There's a whole bunch of other social media accounts that you can find here. Finally, because we are kind of out of time here, I want to end with 5 practical things that everyone on this call can do to ensure no harm in volunteering. And I want to apologize because these are probably less practical than like step 1, like, I don't know, get a hat or something like that. It's like, it is still a little bit pie in the sky. But since we're all coming from this from slightly different places, I thought that almost like 5 of the most core ethics that we start with is a more helpful way of doing this. And the first is we should only ever engage in community-driven partnerships. And that goes for virtual spaces right now as well, right? The concept of community is super complicated, but basically if you're not invited or if you're not inviting others, should not be there. Someone should not be coming to Pittsburgh and telling me I need a library. Right? That is a very weird, insulting thing to do, and yet it's almost like one of the commonplace starting points for this type of work globally. We need to be really open to changes. We need to be open to relationships being different. I mean, where we were founded in Brazil is a completely different town than it was, 25, 30 years ago. 2, expectations. We need to clarify them and re-clarify them over and over and over again. We need to be very clear about commitments. Is this a short-term relationship? If so, that's totally cool, totally kosher, fine. But if one party thinks it's short-term, one party thinks it's long-term, that's a real problem. Write things down and move forward slowly. Talk about money. I know it's awkward. I know, we all want to start from a place of being good helpers and good listeners, but money's going to matter at some point. Opportunities are going to pop up, grants are going to show up, donors are going to come around the corner, projects are going to end. Apparently pandemics are going to dismantle everything. People are going to lose income. So like we need to just be upfront about this. And I can't emphasize this enough. 12, 13 years ago when I first jumped into the Amazaji's landscape, I was kind of hesitant to talk about money, and it burned some relationships. And so now, we try to be very transparent about it as much as we can across all boundaries. Commit to solidarity and safety. The pandemic has really reminded me of this over and over again. Sometimes at the end of the day, it's all we can commit to. Committing to starting with do no harm. Committing to making sure that community members and visitors are going to be protected, and engaging in projects throughout all of the weird things that are going to happen in the world, and always protecting the most vulnerable. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, we need to maintain joy and justice. We really should be rethinking all of our relationships and projects if if some component of joy cannot be a part of them. You know, after harming a lot of people in this world, probably unfortunately through this work, and also probably having, you know, contributed really positively to a lot of people's lives in this world, you know, I can safely say that we can really kind of have no justice unless we're also maintaining some level of joy. All right, thank you very much, and I guess it's time for questions.